The early English colonies were transplanted societies. They were walled off from Indians. They were feeble attempts to recreate England on the American continent. America, though, was destined to be a middle ground of cultural exchange and conflict with Native Americans. Early English expeditions were privately backed undertakings by English trading companies given official permission by the royal monarchy. So the government of Europe did not specifically send people to create these colonies. They were private undertakings by business that were in the interests of the government and given permission by the government. At the first successful colony, Jamestown, which is in present-day Virginia, the first colonists nearly died out from malaria in the harsh winters. Only a second expedition of supplies kept the colony alive. The English were generally slow to adapt to life on the American continent, and they relied on imported goods from England for many, many years just to get by. The Virginia Company brought 600 people to Jamestown before the starving time. That's a period of time when Native Americans clear-cut forests and forced the colonists to survive on dogs, rats, leather, anything they could eat. The colonists at Jamestown had to. They'd wall themselves up. Native Americans were fearful, didn't know what was happening, didn't know who these white people were, and they tried to starve them out. These people took the journey for stock in the company, and some were poor people. They came as indentured servants, many of them. Poor people who agreed to work for the company in the New World for a period of 7 years once they got here. Relief expeditions from England and the discovery of tobacco as an export product to Europe kept the colony afloat. Tobacco soon drove colonists southward for more land and better soil once they got here. The implementation of a headright system prompted larger English families to move to the New World altogether. They were promised 50 acres per person if they would come, establishing the first American plantations and promising economic opportunities to families brave enough to leave Europe behind. So there's all these pull reasons, there's all these reasons to head to the New World, especially if you've got an economic incentive. So you can make money by traveling to the New World, but once you're there, you're pretty much stuck with your family. But there is opportunity here. The first Africans in the Americas were brought as servants to Virginia. Indians were used as forced labor too. Pocahontas, though, was a native from the Jamestown colony. She became a Christian and traveled to Europe, propelling an interest in quote-unquote civilizing natives, and the enslavement of natives became culturally taboo. She was very well received in Europe, and it became a big no-no to try to enslave Native Americans after that. In the end, 80% of the 8,500 white English settlers who came early on died within 17 years of landing at Jamestown. Colonization was a risky proposition, and success was never assured. English settlers survived only when they adopted native lifestyles and practices, specifically in regards to agriculture. The first settlers from England were businessmen. They weren't farmers, but they quickly had to become farmers to have enough food to survive each winter. The canoe, which is perfectly suited to the narrow inland waterways of the Americas, serves as a great example of colonists' reliance on quote-unquote uncivilized natives for the means of survival on the American continent. What I'm saying is that the Americas are not England. It's a different place when they get here. And the English are very reluctant to change who they are, to become, I guess, American, for lack of a better word. Once they do, they're successful. Once they start acting more like Native Americans, they do a lot better. Beyond the colony at Jamestown, the colony at Maryland began as a refuge for English Catholics, though Protestants were invited along to make the expedition profitable. Remember, I said that Anglicanism was the official religion of England. So Catholics who aren't especially welcome to practice Catholicism, a lot of them leave for Maryland. It's specifically designed to be a place of religious liberty. The 1649 Act concerning religion decreed religious freedom in the colony of Maryland, and it pointed to a tolerant future regarding religion in the Americas. In all else, though, Maryland was a lot like Jamestown, Virginia. So we've got all these white people coming over. They're coming over to work, but that's going to lead to conflict, especially when these people head out into Indian territory. Bacon's rebellion was a backcountry rebellion in Virginia politics. It was an effort, unaided by the colony's governor, to displace and fight back against natives, and it threatened the legitimacy of the colony's unrepresentative government. Bacon's rebellion expressed frustration on the part of colonists, white colonists, unable to shape colonial decisions and unwilling to draw lines between native and colonial territory. So Nathaniel Bacon, that's where it gets its name from, is an example of the continuing problem of defining white and native spheres in the New World. After Bacon's rebellion, the transplanted wealthy and political elites of the American colonies, including the governors of these colonies, they understood that they needed to control their free, white, and politically unrepresented workers, but they lacked the infrastructure and the government and the systems to actually control these people. They certainly didn't want to give any of their power up. Slaves purchased from Africa, some soon realized, could fill their need for manual labor, and they would pose less risk to the order and hierarchy of colonization. This is the first realization that if you want workers in the Americas, it makes more sense to buy your labor if you can. These people come as indentured servants, but 7 years later, they're free to travel west, to get into fights with Native Americans, to start a backcountry war, which threatens business. So these wealthy and political elites start to think about slavery as a viable option, especially when they move to a plantation economy. The Pilgrims, as celebrated every Thanksgiving in the United States, were Puritan separatists that landed at Plymouth Rock in December of 1620. They were forced, they landed in the winter, obviously. They were forced to rely on Indians that first winter just to get by. And they are some of the few examples of English colonists actually cooperating with natives. That band of Indians that helped those colonists out, the Pilgrims out, they died out due to smallpox 13 years later. And the Pilgrims as a group remained a poor religious minority in America. Events in England continued to encourage Puritans to migrate to the Americas. Merchants, too, migrated. The Massachusetts Bay Company left for the New World to create an economic entity that supported Puritan goals. So people move for business and religion, and sometimes those things merge. Families moved, too, which allowed the colonies in and around Boston to flourish, because if it wasn't just men coming, if families came, you'd have schools, you'd have churches, etc. Other early colonies and colonists expanded for three reasons. Once they got here, they left where they landed for better soil, for a different sort of religious freedom, and for land. Connecticut was settled much like Massachusetts. Rhode Island became a haven for religious freedom, founded by radical Massachusetts minister Roger William. Similarly, Anne Hutchinson's challenge to Massachusetts hierarchy in that colony led to the settlement of Maine and New Hampshire. So once people got here, they weren't necessarily done and set in their colony. Once they got here, if they didn't like what the colony represented or the rules of the colony, they might strike out on their own and start a new colony. That happened many times. As new colonies were established, constructive relationships between white settlers and natives turned sour, mostly by white land ambitions. Indians were understood as helpful neighbors when colonists first arrived, for the most part, but they were disparaged as heathens when their usefulness ran out, or when they refused to cede land desired by whites. King Philip's War between Massachusetts settlers and natives in the region was the first formal conflict between the Old and the New World on the North American continent, and it introduced flintlock muskets by both sides and foreshadowed future conflicts and bloodshed. 30 years after Maryland was chartered, after the English Civil War ended with the Restoration, Carolina, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania were authorized by a tax-hungry King Charles II. Carolina was a divided global economy. Slavers from Barbados moved into the South, and the North was dominated by backwoods farmers. Organized into counties, its North-South politics foreshadowed the system of American politics that was set to emerge after the Revolution. New York and New Jersey were contested colonies, uniquely diverse in population. Pennsylvania was born out of a Quaker desire to practice pacifism or anti-war politics and to pursue religious salvation freely. Pennsylvania was a well-organized colony that flourished without conflict with native peoples, for the most part. Outside that Atlantic seaboard, that Atlantic Ocean seaboard, were the borderlands, or the middle ground, areas of exchange and dependence between Europeans and native peoples. Only half of English settlers landed on the North American seaboard. The other half landed in Bermuda, Jamaica, and on, other Caribbean islands alongside the Spanish colonies of Cuba and Puerto Rico. So we tend to think of English colonies specifically as places like Jamestown, Virginia, and the Carolinas. But these people were also landing way down south and even off the American continent. The Caribbean West Indies presented perfect conditions for the planting of sugar once whites arrived. Natives to these islands were wiped out by disease and violence early on after early colonists arrived, and the land was refashioned by Europeans in short order. Growing sugarcane is a labor-intensive practice which soon required, quote-unquote, the use of slave labor when white indentured servants refused to do the back-breaking work. Soon, more than 3 times as many slaves populated the tropical islands as whites. English colonists looking for slave labor in the Chesapeake soon turned to the burgeoning slave trade of the Caribbean, accelerating the rate at which West African slaves were funneled into the region. I said that very, very quickly. Let me go back a little bit. When the English came to the Americas, they didn't just come to present-day United States, the East Coast. They also landed on these different islands to practice religion. Once they got to some of these islands, they realized that they could make a lot of money. And so it wasn't just colonists seeking religious freedom, it was also English and European business interests landing on islands. Once they got there, a lot of the natives were killed, either intentionally or unintentionally, by disease. And then Europeans very quickly realized they could plant sugarcane and make a lot of money off that sugar. Indentured servants didn't want to do all that hard work. And so those English colonists began to look at slave labor markets and import African slaves, which they could buy legitimately from Africa. But the rate at which those slaves were brought only accelerated because as tobacco became a more profitable industry in the American colonies, those tobacco growers started to buy slaves from the Caribbean, from their fellow Englishmen in the Caribbean islands. And so all of a sudden we have a booming market, and the pace of production of creating slaves can't even keep up with it. In the southwest borderlands, Texas, Florida, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, Spanish colonists converted natives to Catholicism and put them to work, building agricultural systems of organization and constructing forts to defend against English colonial ambitions. So remember the Spanish, they're still around. While the English are landing on the American continent, the Spanish are still here, and they're putting, instead of enslaving Africans, they're enslaving Native Americans to build forts to defend and hold their territories, places like California, like New Mexico and Florida. The southeast borderlands of North Florida and Georgia, the last English colony, existed as places of tension between the Spanish and the English colonists. 100 years of skirmishes on the continent ended with the 7 Years' War, what we sometimes call the French and Indian War, which left England the dominant colonial power in North America. The struggle for the North American continent was a conflict of European powers propelled by religious differences, and for many, it was a fight for power, culture, and legitimacy. For many years, though, a middle ground between European power and native wildness existed. On the peripheries, or on the side of empire, whites and Indians were often forced to cooperate. Europeans were both menacing and appealing to Native Americans. Without a conception of a nation, Native Americans looked to whites for friendship, kinship, and leadership. The French of the Great Lakes region best cooperated with natives. They created peaceful terms of coexistence for decades. Make no mistake about it, relationships between the whites and natives on the American continent were not doomed from the start. Cowboys versus Indians was not inevitable, and to most people on both sides, conflict was not the outcome they had hoped for. The English colonies, which I have covered briefly, started as separate projects, but quickly coalesced into a politically unified effort at empire. Though these colonists had arrived in separate places for different reasons, a shared English colonial identity grew between colonists in places like Virginia and New Jersey. And only then did the colonies begin to think of themselves as a collective entity distinct from their homeland. When they arrived, they very much still thought of themselves as English. Living side by side, did they begin to think of themselves as Carolinian or Pennsylvanian. American colonies were also coming into their own at the end of the 17th century. The South, what I will call the Chesapeake, was increasingly focused on growing tobacco and cotton with slave labor, while free labor and religion dominated the culture of the North, the area I call New England. New York, Boston, and Charleston emerged as centers of trade, both import and export, with England. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 abroad touched off democratic reforms in the colonies, and the colonies became more aligned with one another, became more integral to the imperial aims of the homeland. So as more and more people moved to these colonies, it's not just a sort of like footnote on the British Empire. The colonies become more and more important as more and more people are there, but also to the economy of England. England becomes to depend on the exports and the imports of the colonies. As the 17th century ended, the rest of the continent remained sparsely populated by Indians, French, and Spanish, who dominated the landmass and lived in relative coexistence and loose cooperation. Changes underway all across the British Empire, though, foreshadowed greater territorial ambitions. The English were not finished with the North American continent.